Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Have moved along in this epistle of the Colossians, with this being lesson number 11 in our series. And today's lesson focuses on chapter 3, verses 5 through 11. These verses are connected, though, very closely with the reading we had last year, the first 4 verses in chapter 3. They deal with putting the old worldly life away that these people had before conversion and baptism. So recall in the previous lesson, the author was affirming that believers died with Christ and are raised with Christ at baptism. This section commands they are to now live a new life in accordance with that blessing God has granted them. Today's lesson spells out some of the specifics to what has to be done to put away that old life and change to the needs of the new life as they prepare themselves for the coming judgment and eschatological events. So let's read Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 through 11, and it may sound a little different. We're going to read in the New Revised Standard Version, the updated edition. Starting with verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient. These are the ways you also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self and its practices, and have clothed yourself with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its Creator. In that renewal, there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, enslaved and free, but Christ is all and in all. Several scholars note these verses are generally understood, but not well adhered to by Christians today. And for the most part, they are not complicated to understand. Dr. Scott McKnight of Northern Seminary in Illinois comments on these verses with, "This section of verses articulates what the gospel does to moral life of a believer, centered around participation by the believer in the death with Christ. He teaches that each verse must be considered both as a standalone and in light of the other verses in this section. So the preceding verses 1 through 4 focused on Gentile converts who have entered into the new family of God, which brings the Gentiles into the same family as Israel, and this family is the church. This family now must learn how to live in that family with Christ as their Lord, while still in the Roman Empire where the emperor is Lord." Dr. Jerry Sumney at Lexington Theological Seminary notes that as one studies these verses, you see that this new life is to be one devoted to holiness that encompasses both personal and communal morality. Social historical scholars note that this was very different from most religious options of their time in first century. Very few moral expectations were required of an adherent to most of those religions. Thus, to extend to what is presented here as a command, essentially, likely would have been a rude awakening for new Gentile converts to Christianity in this region of the world at this time. And we have to realize here that in mentioning the various people, one particular group of people, the Scythians, was mentioned here. All the rest was sort of general terms. The Scythians were, we might add, this was a group of people that spoke Iranian, the original Iranian language, but they were not in maybe in the parts of the very northern extent of what is today Iran, but these people were in the Baltic regions, especially the western part of the Baltic, the eastern part of the Baltic regions, and up into the eastern Eurasian steppes. So it would be what is today Ukraine, Western Russia, Moldova, Belarus, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Georgia. So, large people that essentially over time became much more Slavic, and that's essentially what happened. Was this group, this people, the Scythians, and somewhere by roughly I think roughly by the 2nd or 3rd century BC, but clearly by the time of Paul here, these people were essentially more Slavic, and had essentially been conquered by those Slavic type peoples and incorporated. So people with a very different set of values than the Jews, and different from the value system of the normal Greek and value system of the normal Romans, are being mentioned here as people who need to be included. Dr. Elizabeth MacDonald notes, it is important to realize Paul here is referring back to the transformation that occurred in their own baptism. Consequently, this is an admonition that they should already be living this appropriate new life. So some apparently were not, she says. She also teaches, note carefully, that in verses 5 through 11, actually it covers the ethical side of the changes, but clearly implies baptism is central to these verses and not just of a sideline interest. And to get that point, you have to read those previous 4 verses, which we were clearly reminded in the opening are tied together. She suggests baptismal issues likely figured in the conflict surrounding the need for this letter called Colossians, which gets included, many scholars today include this under the little c Catholicism, that is, not the Catholic Church as we know it, but the world church. So that this is not just addressed to a city of Colossae, that most scholars today tend to be moving in a direction. This is much more universal church doctrine. The early Christian literature outside the church provides ample evidence that baptismal experiences were powerfully received in these other faiths, but the meaning of the actual ritual and its interpretation varied much and was ambiguous in many ways. And so we have to realize also these people are bringing in an understanding of baptism from other religions too that have to be negated here or reinterpreted. We should appreciate, she notes, that baptism was practiced in many religions of that day and is thus had many and varied functions and meanings. Thus, in part, the letter of Colossians was needed to try to shape the teachings related to baptism in the new Christian community as this faith entered new areas and new populations. And there are other scholars that agree with her on that. Excuse me. Especially needed, it seems, was something to document the meaning of baptism beyond just a ritual event, she says. That is a ritual event in time and space. Oh, it's much deeper. Colossians clearly does that here, she says, especially when you look at the whole book. Dr. Michael Bird approaches this differently. He and the evangelical community in general look at this a little differently, that they have died for the Messiah, then they must enact this death and put to death the believer's earthly beings and adopt a spiritual being, is the way the evangelical community tends to interpret it. Tend to address it from the standpoint of more spiritual mode, she says, and he says. Bird says Colossians teaches one is either dead to sin, Colossians 3:5, or dead in sin, Colossians 2:13, that we studied here a few weeks ago. He says the point is to allow a heavenly perspective to determine one's being and actions rather than natural earthly behaviors. Then Paul lists those vices that must be stopped. The vices listed here differ from the common list found elsewhere in Christianity and the Jewish writings. Some vices were also restricted by the Greco-Roman ethics and rules and mores, because it was believed such behavior adversely affected society's welfare. It had nothing to do with religion, so to speak. And some of the pagan religions believed that certain behaviors could occasion the wrath of their gods, little g. So there were some rules and so forth, but nothing like what you find in the Judeo-Christian ethic. There is variation as to what vices are listed in translations, even of the scriptures we just read. But whatever list exists, they tend to fall into two major subgroups, teaches Dr. Scott McKnight, either sins of desire or sins of disunity, and disunity meaning disunity among themselves as well as disunity with Christ and God. He and others note Paul's list here in Colossians is remarkably similar to those found in the rules of the community which were discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That connection wasn't made until fairly modern times, when they found those Dead Sea Scrolls and was able to interpret them and realize they're nearly word for word in many places. Jewish writers note all these rules go back to the holiness code, however, that's been long-standing in the Israelite Jewish community. McKnight notes that in the Greek here of Colossians, in the Greek as it is written, the command is put to death in verse 5 and rid yourself of in verse 8. Furthermore, he and others note the traditional baptismal practice of disrobing and re-robing with white garments is a display of death at baptism and purification upon rising, putting to death the vices and re-robing clean of them and anew. Some scholars note the emphasis here on sexual mores comes from Judaism. Jews were different and stricter than others in the Mediterranean world at this time concerning sexual mores. They taught that compelling oneself to follow the Levitical laws rather than letting nature's laws rule was very much what distinguished the Jew as a race of people and a religious group from all other people of the world. By allowing natural acts to rule their behavior, was their belief, other men defile themselves before God, and they also defile themselves before the women of their community, their mothers, their women, and their daughters. Theological sociologists suggest that a reason for this list focused on sexual vices was also a realization that a husband-wife relationship is first and foremost the most profound human relationship in which faith has to be proved and taught, notes Dr. McKnight. He also notes that the sexual contact of the Roman Empire likely impacted, context of the Roman Empire likely impacted in part what Paul leads here with in the Greek word, and the Greek word that's used there is very straight, it's porneia, which refers to general sexual immoralities in that language, and refers back to essentially the Jewish Torah, the wording in the Torah translated into Greek. He says, remember, both of these authors, Paul and Timothy here in Colossians, are Jewish by birth, and it is those common Torah ethics that are passed on and become standard early Christian ethics. And the Jews had an established list of those sins in Leviticus 18. Jews considered that Leviticus 18 was God's covenant gift to the Israelites, as it both clarified how to live and set them apart from the pagan or Gentile peoples of the world. What is the theology that Paul is using here, some ask? Marcus Bart and Helmut Blank, in their 1994 commentary on Colossians, cite the coming judgment, and especially God's wrath is central here, but you need to understand what's meant by the wrath of God when referring to the big G God. Dr. Jerry Sumney notes this first century audience was accustomed to thinking in terms of what the little G God, required of them. And they thought of it as that those gods were vengeful and dangerously capricious in nature. But that is not what wrath means here in this context coming from Judaism. The first century author of the New Testament do not view gods, that is the big G God, condemnation as anything beyond what is just and due. They view this as justice, and justice is an essential characteristic of God and one that must be evident in God's judgment and acts. That's central to Judaism in the Judeo-Christian ethic. Thus, when Colossians calls God's condemnation of those who practice these vices in verse 5 there, wrath, these authors are likely meaning that they have these authors' thinking in mind, and probably intended as meaning that which may not be the same as what the Gentiles mean. In other words, they had the Jewish belief and concept, and that's what they're trying to pass on, and that may not be the same interpretation these former pagan people in Colossia and in these other regions that Christianity is now moving into, or what's out there today. So basically the Judeo-Christian ethic is that this idea that God's wrath could not be anything but what is just and appropriate. Verse 8 through 11 makes strong demands of the Colossians. Sumney teaches it clearly delineates further what the reader must leave behind and why, and ways of living that are incompatible with their new identity in Christ. In Christ, God has granted believers a new self that demands a new way of living. Dr. Bird notes that at the very end of verse 11 is a powerful parenthetical remark that the Messiah is for all and in all. He suggests this statement implies these people are intended as a model for the world as to what God intended humans to be: a loving community unified in worship of their Creator and loyal to their Christian, their Messiah Lord. Not unified by, not unified by some other set of rules such as race, nationality, etc. Messiah is all, Jews and Gentiles, circumcised and uncircumcised. The Messiah is there for all races and classes and resides in the benefits conferred to each. Jesus' death and resurrection is for all. Jesus is for all, regardless of their race, their gender, their political party, their nationality, etc. And go on and on and on. He is either your Lord or someone else's, Bird says. And to those people, the authors are essentially asking, is Jesus Christ your Lord, or is it the Roman emperor? You must decide. It's implied. You don't come right out and say it. We have to understand at this day and time that certain things that might get said could cause you to lose your head. So there's a lot of implied stuff in the New Testament. We can extend then, as we go into our discussion, and think about what this means today. Who or what is your Lord today? That gives you maybe some idea of how these scholars that I've quoted here today are looking at this part of Colossians. And hope you have a good Bible study, and we'll continue on with our next lesson.